In a world without steering wheels, people play with game controllers. Now, it's a bit crazy playing a driving simulator with a game controller. Why would you want to do that? Well, as you might be able to hear from my voice, I've come down with the plague, probably from rummaging around elderberry hedges, and unearthed some godly disease that's made my arms have the strength of a hamster. So, or a T-Rex, probably a better example. Maybe they had really strong hands, but they were really small, and they certainly could not have sim raced. But I digress. I can't use my G25 because I have no energy at all. So I loaded up Assetto Corsa and I was like, well, let's see if I can get it working well with the joystick. Now, by default, the joystick is, I say joystick, the Gamepad Xbox 360 pad settings are a bit gloopy and slow, and that's pretty typical as to what you find with most console driving games, or when you have control set up for a game controller. So I spent a good couple of hours fiddling around with it and getting it so that you can drive the cars fairly well with a gamepad without having any assists on, and essentially approach the cars as you would if you were driving with a steering wheel. So, as you can see there, I'm like making a dog's dinner of it, but I can correct the steering. Before I go through the settings, I'm just gonna finish this lap and show the sort of input that I'm getting. Now, I have put a bit of speed sensitivity on it, so that if you're going at high speed, you don't want to accidentally launch yourself off the track by tapping the joystick. Ooh. It is really hard driving with a game controller, especially with the brake and the accelerator on the bottom. But the key thing that I wanted to get working well was just the joystick input, and having it so that it's sensitive enough that you can counter steer and apply a bit of opposite lock when powering out corners, but not too sensitive so that when you're driving down the straight you can do these sort of little nudges just to get around the corner and drive a really smooth racing line. Now, I've not had much practice with this, I've only had a day of sort of driving with it, but I think I've actually got it to a level where if you only have a game controller and you put a serious amount of time into it, well, you could actually lay down some alright laps. Or most importantly, you're going to be in control of all the situations that you get the car into. I found with the default Xbox controller settings, you get into situations that you couldn't recover from purely because the controls were locking you out of being able to recover it. Now, it's worth reiterating, these controls are for people that want more precise input, and it is really finicky and tricky in its own way. If you're new to a driving game, you're probably better off with more sluggish controls that force you to learn to basically stay under the limit and not have to correct the car and balance the car. But if you're fine with that and you actually get enjoyment out of fiddling around with the car and playing with it, and you want that precision, then that's what these controls are for. Basically, this is for those of you that are used to playing with a wheel but are crippled and are being forced to use a potato controller. Okay, so if you're starting out with the controls, you might want to start out with just applying the default Xbox controller, which you can do by just going through configuration presets, scrolling down, you'll see it there, just click it there and click apply, and that'll apply the default settings. Now, I'm going to go through each setting and tell you what each one does, and then tell you what I've set mine to and why. So initially, speed sensitivity is how sensitive the car is depending on its speed. So the faster you go, the less sensitive the steering input will be, which stops you from accidentally throwing the car into a wall by just tapping the joystick when you're at high speed. The other settings are on the advanced tab. You just click the advanced button up there. So you've got the steering speed, which is the input speed, so how sensitive the stick is, just in general, how sensitive the steering input is. 1% is the lowest, 100%, and it will be absolutely insanely sensitive. Gamma is it's a curve of how it interprets the steering input. So the more gamma you have, the less sensitive the analog stick is in the center, and then it gets more and more and more sensitive the more you move to the outside. Now, why that's good is that you might want to have less sensitivity right at the center of the steering wheel because you're going to be doing really finicky driving. But if you're doing a lock-to-lock save of the car, you're probably just going to be slamming your joystick left and right, and so you'll want it to be more sensitive there. So the gamma is for allowing less sensitivity at the center of the analog joystick and more sensitivity at the edge of the analog joystick. Of course, you can set the gamma to 1, where basically it's a linear, it's the same sensitivity all the way through the analog joystick, or you can set it to 4, where it's a ridiculous curve. The filters the joystick inputs so that it averages, well, I believe this, it averages the input, making it filtered and more smooth. So if you're not very precise on your finger, it's going to make the steering look more accurate when it's mapped to the actual steering wheel. It just smooths out your input basically, and is a filter, surprisingly. And the dead zone is pretty self-explanatory. It's a dead zone in the center of the joystick, so it will ignore any movement that's in the dead zone. And if you've got an Xbox 360 controller, they are really sensitive in the center. If you breathe on it, it'll probably start giving an input. I believe the Xbox 360 controller actually has 256 points of input to it, so you can literally tap the controller and that will move it, give the game probably 10-20 points of input. So anyway, going to my settings, just applying mine that I've already done. I can't remember them to slide them as I go through, so I've got them saved here. Load settings. I've got the speed sensitivity set to 54, which is lower than the default, so it's a lot less sensitive to high speed, so you have to be more careful when you're going fast compared to the defaults. I prefer to try and make things as linear as possible. That way I think it's easier to learn than if you've got loads of systems where you've got stuff that's non-linear, so you have to approach everything in a different way. If it's linear, you approach the car in the same way all the time consistently, if that makes sense. So speed sensitivity set to 54%. Steering speed set to 25%, which is a lot more sensitive than the defaults. Now, if you're moving the joystick left and right, it's going to look like you've got lightning hands, the speed of light. But once you've got used to using this control scheme, you'll find that you'll actually just be doing really delicate input. And the idea of having the speed sensitivity so high is that at 25% from my little experimentation session, that seemed to be the minimum in order to allow you to recover the car from any given situation. So if you you got the back end out unintentionally on the brakes, or you powered out of a corner wrong, you need to correct it. A sensitivity of 25 allows you enough sensitivity to using the analog stick to recover the car. So steering speed 25%. The gamma set to 2, so there is a little bit of less sensitivity at the center of the analog joystick, partly to recover from aspects of the design of Xbox 360 controller and just the nature of using a joystick. I found 2 work really well. Filter 0.3 just makes it look a little bit more natural on the screen, but again, using a gamepad, it's not going to look like you're driving a car with a wheel, because a gamepad is not a wheel. And I set the dead zone to 0.45, which is quite a lot, but that's because there's a lot of flex in the center of the Xbox 360 analog stick, in that there's no spring to it, and it does give input. So by setting the dead zone there, you're only going to be turning the car once you start pushing against the spring that's in the analog stick, and that seemed to feel just about right. But with those settings, go through them again quickly. Sensitivity 54%, steering speed 25%, gamma 2, filter 0.3, dead zone 0.45, rumble effects set to whatever you want. That to me gave a really good, precise control of the car. It's difficult, it's responsive, but it allows you to drive with very precise input. Now the other buttons that you can just set them to whatever you want. They're all the bog standard. Doesn't really matter. It's the crucial aspect is simply the steering input with the joystick, and I think I've got it to a reasonable level. If you wanted to make it slightly less sensitive without changing the other settings, say for example you tried these settings that I've done and you want to build upon it rather than just start from scratch, I would recommend just altering the steering speed and increase a bit of the filter. Those two, and just try it with those altering those settings and see how they affect it before fiddling with the other ones, because those are more with everything else set as it is, it sort of gets around the problems of a joystick, whereas the steering speed and the filter will allow you to dial it into your preference while still maintaining the settings that I've sort of hammered out that seem to, in my opinion, it's going to be largely subjective anyway, but in my opinion, allow you a good degree of control if you wanted to have high accuracy and do pro top level sim racing with an Xbox controller, if that's even possible. But I hope that video's of help. I know it's really exciting looking at a menu and setting up a joystick, but if you happen to lose your arms and need to drive with your toes using a game controller, or you don't have a steering wheel at the moment and you want to use a game controller, maybe this was of use to you. So thanks for watching this video. Subscribe and like, have a cup of tea, and all that business.